Hello, this is Stuart with a little video showing you some silicone pigmentation. One of the things I think is the best way really to see silicone being coloured is to actually do it in front of a camera so you can actually watch how the colour changes. So that's what we're going to do. We're actually going to mix some pigments into some silicone. So the pigments I like to use, basically silicone pigments, you will find them wherever you sort of obtain your silicone from. They typically stock pigments, and they will also stock flocking, which is tiny little nylon or rayon fibers, which are available in different lengths and different colours. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start mixing my silicone just using I'm sort of cheating here basically. I'm using a basic flesh tone colour here, which is a standard sort of Caucasian flesh tone, and it's a good colour to start with. I start with a small amount of pigment and I use a mixing stick which has a black dot drawn on in a Sharpie, and that basically is going to help me see how the opacity changes as I add the pigment. So I might get the colour correct, but it might be that it's too translucent. So the way you can actually sort of quantify to some degree is by using a stick that has a black dot painted on it, and if the mixing stick is pale, you'll see this black dot showing through, and it'll give you an indication of how the opacity is changing as you add your pigments to it. So basically the way I'm going to do this is just add tiny bits of pigment and just build up slowly so I don't accidentally add too much. You'll find that silicone pigments are usually very concentrated, so it's very easy to put what you think is a small amount in, but depending on how much silicone you're mixing up, it can be like a drastic mistake. You can put a drip into a small cup like this and suddenly the whole thing's opaque and you've ruined it. So you need to proceed with caution with pigments until you're more certain of how concentrated they are and how heavy-handed you are when you squeeze that bottle to drop it in there. Now I'm using two cameras here to video this, and you can see that they both have slightly different colouring, but hopefully they should both look correct against my skin, because ultimately I'm using my eyes to make sure that the skin that I'm mixing is matching my own skin. And I'm using the inside of my arm just because it's available and it's right there, so I can show you how I'm going to make the modifications as I go by offering the pigment up to my arm and then making a judgment at each stage as to what I think it needs to be changed by. So in this instance, I figured it's a little too orange, so I'm going to add some blue. And if I use a pin to drop tiny bits of blue in there, it's much safer than actually dropping some blue pigment in direct from the bottle, because the trouble with blue is it's very easy to add way too much accidentally and just turn the whole thing into a big smurf kind of blue, which you don't want to do. I kind of liken adding blues and greens and stuff like adding salt to soup. When you want to make a soup taste more savory, you add a little bit of salt. If it tastes of salt, then clearly you've added too much. And it's like that with blue. You want just enough blue to kill the orange, but not so much blue that it actually looks blue. Unless, of course, your intention is to make it blue. But I'm trying to match this, the skin on the inside of my arm. So I'm using here just a tongue stick to offer it up. This is why I like clear cups, because you can actually offer it up to the skin if the skin's available, and you can then see through the plastic how it looks when it's pressed up against the skin without making a mess. But here you can see I'm offering it up. It's not far off, but it still needs a little something, so I'm going to have to add some little bits of something to change it. So the first thing I'm going to add is a little bit more blue, just to kind of kill. I'm still seeing some oranginess there, and also I want to brighten it slightly, so I'm going to add some white too, and then I'm going to stir all that in and see how that changes before checking again and offering it up. You can see here that I'm using gloves. I always wear gloves that are not latex gloves. These are nitrile gloves, and that just stops pigment from getting all over your fingers, because it's a messy business mixing silicone colours. So here it's not far off again, but it's still a little something. So I'm going to have to add a little something just to kind of tweak it. And again, we're talking about very small amounts of anything. I certainly want it redder, so I'm going to add some red flocking to it, and that helps give it sort of like a broken veiny kind of finish. And also I want it yellower too. And sometimes I found that yellow pigment has a lot of white in it, so I'm actually going to add some yellow using flocking, because that will then give it a slightly yellow tint, but without actually making it too opaque. So I'm going to go with a little bit of red as well. I know I've added the red flocking, but I just fancied using some red pigment too, just to kind of see how that would compare and show you, obviously you've got the specks which give you a nice broken up vein finish, but you could also just use the pigments. I know some people that only really use flocking, they don't really use pigments at all, but I do like to use a bit of both. One thing I have noticed when you add a lot of flocking is that it can thicken the silicone as well, because the fibers actually cause it to sort of turn into a much thicker liquid, which if you're trying to inject it into molds can be an issue, because you'd be slowing that silicone down. So I don't tend to use a huge amount of flocking when pigmenting. I tend to rely mainly on the pigments, and I'll add a little bit of flocking just to give it a slight change. So I'm going to mix up in total 3 different flesh tones. So the first one I've done there, and the middle one I'm going to do now. I'm actually going to mix this up slightly differently. What I'm going to do, instead of adding it to the silicone, I'm actually going to mix up the bulk of the colour as pure pigment first into a little dish. So I've got this little plastic dish here, and I'm just squirting some flesh tone silicone base into. And I'm going to modify this slightly with pure pigments. I'm going to start with a bit of red. You'll see that it does drastically change as I see, what I add and whether or not it's effective. I can start adding a lot more of something. But again, with all of these things, you want to proceed with caution. Just creep up on it slowly. You don't want to make huge changes quickly. Otherwise, you may find that you just ruin your whole batch of pigment because you've got a bit excited and put too much blue in or something. So I've added some red and some yellow there, which is going to make it a bit more orange. And then to sort of kill that off, I'm going to need to add something to neutralize that, because I want it darker and certainly less bright. So I'm adding blue to that, which I'll mix in. And as you can see, that kind of gives a weird sort of purpley, greeny dead look, which is not what I'm after. But again, the point of this is to show you how the colors change as I add more and more different pigments to it. So I'm adding some blue and some red, which of course gives it a very purpley kind of feel, which is not a great color. But once I add some yellow to that, obviously that'll bring it back around again, because obviously yellow is the spectral opposite of purple, and then they'll make it a kind of a warmer brown, but it still needs to be darker as well. So I'm going to add quite a bit more of everything, a lot more yellow, a lot more red, and try and bring it right down so it's much darker. But one of the things you do notice with a lot of darker skins is they do need to be as warm as well. It's very common for people to make them very ashy and very sort of grey. We want to make sure that the colour is going to be it looks like a live skin. So adding some sort of browns and stuff. Be cautious you don't use anything that's too sort of flat and dull. You want to use something that's quite warm and bright, so it does look like live skin rather than just a sort of a flat muted colour. So I'm adding my kind of corrected pigment into the silicone base, which as you can see was clear. This was just clear dead now. Again, using that tongue stick that has a little black dot on it, it makes it very clear to me, how much pigment I've added, because I'm going to go quite a bit more opaque than this. A lot of people make silicones, they tend to make them a bit too translucent, and that can make the pieces look very waxy, and you don't want to have waxy pieces. It looks weird when you start putting makeup on the top, because the makeup that you apply on the top of a very translucent piece can look like it's sitting on a kind of a glassy surface. So you want to match the opacity of the skin that you're going to be putting it onto. With regards to making it warm, like I mentioned before, you don't want it to be sort of a flat, dead looking kind of colour. So I'm going to add a lot more yellow to this to give it some life. And again, I could have used a lot of yellow pigment, but I like using flocking for the yellow, because as I've said before, sometimes the yellow pigments actually have a lot of white in them to make them bright, and in so doing you may, as well as making it yellower, you may also make it paler, which if you're trying to get a darker skin tone is not going to help you. So using the yellow pigments will give you that kind of that yellowness that you're after without actually also increasing the brightness. So we're getting there with the flocking. That's making a nice difference. You'd be surprised how much yellow you can add, and it still looks okay. Obviously the darker you go, the more it kind of reduces the effect of subtle colours like that. So you may need to add quite a bit more than you think. So now I've got my colour that I was kind of happy with. This is kind of a mid-tone. I've done a pale tone, going for a mid-tone. I've taken some of that mid-tone now, and I'm going to make it even darker to make a third tone. So I'm adding a little bit of pigment there. So I'm going very purple at first, and people always get a bit shocked when they see how much purple it is. But if you add some yellow to it, you'll see here the yellow going in. That is going to make it browner, but it also has the effect sometimes of of, like I say, actually making it a bit more bright as well, because there's a bit of white in with that, mixed in with that yellow. So it may be that it has to be darkened again, but again, the yellow's making it devoid of red, so I'm adding a bit more red pigment to that, just to kind of warm that up. And I'm going crazy with the yellow flocking again. You'll be surprised how much I can throw that in. But it doesn't tend to look like too much. It's you can see I added a lot more yellow to this, a lot more yellow flocking. And because it's, you know, a darker color, the brightness of the flocking doesn't show through as much. So you'll find you end up using a lot more flocking, the darker the color, without it being as drastic a change. Now, one little trick I have found with the silicone is if you're trying to figure out exactly what changes to make, but you're not quite sure what color to add, and you don't want to ruin your whole batch, a little trick is to take a dollop of your color as close as you can find, and then put little drops of silicone pigment around the outer edge, and then basically just smoosh them in at the outside edge, just to see what that pigment does to the skin color you have, and just see if it's likely to take you in the direction you want to go. So here I can smoosh a little bit of blue in there, and then I can see how a tiny bit of blue and how a lot of blue is going to take that color. Same with the yellow, same with the red, and I can actually see how it's going to affect the color without, like I say, committing, you know, a drastic change to my master batch of deadener, because there's nothing more upsetting than having like a kilo of silicone mixed up. You put a drop of something in and then it just ruins all of it, and then you're stuck with that and you've got to start again, and it's an expensive mistake. So that's a neat way of just trying to experiment with pigments, but like I say, without actually ruining your master batch. Thanks very much for watching this video. Now please check out our podcast, which you can subscribe to. We're now on iTunes and of course other podcast apps such as Pocket Cast. So if you're interested in prosthetic effects and makeup effects, and you want to know more and see techniques and hear us chat away and answer your questions, then please do check out our podcast, which is called Battles with Bits of Rubber, because that's pretty much what we do, is just solve all the problems that come along when you're trying to create prosthetics. We do love to hear your questions and get feedback, so you can get in touch through our email, which is stuartandtodd@gmail.com. It's also worth pointing out this video accompanies our article in the latest edition of Neill Gorton's Prosthetics magazine, which is now out on sale. It's an actual magazine made of paper, and you can hold it and read it and keep it on your reference shelf for later. It's a great read. It's packed with nothing but tutorials and in-depth information solely looking at prosthetic makeup and makeup techniques. And there is info and links below this video. So if you're watching it on YouTube, just click on the More button below and you'll see the links which will take you to the various places that you need to go.